So I'm going to go ahead and start recording. So somebody asked also if the last session is posted. It is. It's up on YouTube. It's up on it's even in Blackboard. So yeah, I posted it a couple days ago. And I'll post this one pretty soon too. I usually post the videos a day or two after they're done. Okay. But so just to recap last meeting, and every once in a while, I'm gonna pause because people keep showing up in the waiting room and I have to click to admit them. So if I pause every once in a while and kind of go off to the side, you'll know what that's about. But anyway, from last meeting, we looked at the allegory of the cave a little bit. We got started on the apology, and we didn't do a whole lot, right? We kind of talked about Socrates a bit. We talked about the sophist. I read the first few opening lines where Socrates is distinguishing himself from the accusers in their manner of speech. And then we did, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we talked a little bit about the beginning of his, I hate to use the word defense, but what else are you going to call it? He's defending himself. He's giving us an account of, I guess what he says is like where this, the accusers are saying all this bad stuff about him, and here's why they're saying it, right? Here's the origin of the slander. And he starts telling us this story about himself. He said, it all started when I heard something about myself, and he started questioning himself, and he started questioning others. So somebody help me out here. What was it that Socrates heard about himself, and what did he do? What was it that he heard about himself that made him start questioning himself and questioning others?
He heard that he was the wisest.
Right. So his friend had a brother who went to visit the oracle at Delphi. We covered that last time. And the oracle said that there are none wiser than Socrates, right? And everybody took the oracle very serious. They thought that the god Apollo spoke through this oracle. And the god Apollo was this god of wisdom and truth and honesty. So if the oracle said that there are none wiser than Socrates, then there must be something to it. Now, how did Socrates react, though? Was he, did this make him think, oh, wow, I'm so smart. Yeah, pat me on the back.
He was questioning it because he didn't know, like he seen other people that he believed to be smarter than him. So he was questioning whether that he was the wisest or not.
Right. He's like, surely this is not, this doesn't work. There's no way I can be the smartest. Like you said, I've met so many people that are they gotta be smarter than me. I just thought of this analogy the other day. It's have you ever seen Snow White? I'm assuming most of you at least know the story of Snow White. I watched it when I was a kid. But the Wicked Witch has this mirror on the wall that tells her who is the fairest of them all, right? Imagine you go to IKEA and they have a mirror that does that. But instead of telling you who the fairest, who the best looking is, the mirror tells you who the wisest is. So you go home, you buy this mirror, you put the batteries, you plug it into the wall, whatever, and you stare in the mirror and you say, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the wisest of them all? And it says, you are the wisest. I mean, you might think that was a defective mirror, right? You're like, yeah, I'm pretty clever, but the wisest? Really? What about Einstein, What about MLK? What about these great, geniuses, Isaac Newton and all this stuff, right? So he's freaking out. He's like, but he knows that the oracle will often speak in riddles, right? So the oracle, sometimes you can't always take what it says on face value. You have to investigate. So that's what he does. How does he investigate? What does he do to go investigate the deeper meaning of this proclamation?
He go to other people that he believed was wise and questions their theory of why they believe that.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's basically, this is all review from last time, but that's basically what he does. He goes to the people that have reputations for wisdom. And who does he go to? I think we didn't really get in depth, but we talked about, there were three groups in particular. He kind of systematically goes through one by one to seek wisdom.
Okay, go ahead. He goes to the poets, the famous people basically, or the public figures.
Yeah.
And then I don't remember what the third one was, but I know those two.
So you said public figures. The word politician, I would probably say, like that's what I would use like today. And yeah, you said poets, but there was a third group. Anybody else got it?
Craftsman.
Good. Okay. So he starts with the politicians, and I think we actually did read that passage. I'll reread it real quick here just to sort of get us refreshed. So he goes to the politicians first, then he goes to the poets, and then he goes to the craftsmen. Let me write all three of those in the box here for you guys. So those are the three groups. And what experience does he have? Again, we only went over the politicians, but what happens with them? Is he wiser than them? Does he have wisdom that they don't have, or what's the story there?
He said that they pretend to know things that they don't know.
Right. I think that's definitely one way to characterize it, but I think you might want to add also, I think sometimes it's not even that they're pretending to know something. Like sometimes they actually think they know something, right? So yeah, maybe like some of the sophists, they kind of know that they're just BSing and they're just kind of saying whatever's going to get their way. But he seems to also think there's a real problem with people who actually think they know things and actually think they have wisdom and actually sincerely believe it, but actually don't. And he points that out to them, right? So let's go ahead. Let's read that passage again. You want to say something, though? I had somebody who wanted to jump in. No? Okay. So let me read. This is on page 24. And like I said, I think I read this last time. I think this is right where we ended class. He says, "Consider that I tell you this, because I would inform you about the origin of the slander," right? So why are these guys saying all this bad stuff about me? I'm not doing it, but here's why. Here's where it comes from. Here's where the origin of it is. When I heard this reply, right? When I heard that the oracle said I was the wisest, or there were none wiser, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? What is his riddle? I'm very conscious that I'm not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely he does not lie. It's not legitimate for him to do so. For a long time, I was at a loss as to his meaning. And then I very reluctantly turned to some such investigation as this. I went to one of those reputed wise, thinking that there, if anywhere, I could refute the oracle and say to it, this man is wiser than I, but you said I was. Then when I examined this man, there's no need for me to tell you his name. He was one of our public men. My experience was something like this. I thought he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but he was not. And as a result, he came to dislike me. And so did many of the bystanders. So I withdrew and I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I'm likely to be wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not know. And so, and this is a recurring theme you're going to see throughout these encounters, right? All of these individuals who he talks to seem to think they know something that they don't. What gives him the upper hand is his acknowledgement of that, his acknowledgement of his lack of knowledge, his acknowledgement of his ignorance. So how do they react, though, right? When he points out that they don't know what they think they know. Are they like,
they start to dislike him?
Yeah, they're not happy, right? He's not making them happy. What happens when he goes to, let's go ahead. Oh, and one last thing quick, and then we'll move on to the poets. Notice also this distinction between appearance and truth, right? I mentioned that last lecture, that throughout all Plato's philosophy, this is a dichotomy that he likes to elaborate on quite a bit. And it's throughout a lot of his readings, a lot of his writings, and especially here, you can see that they appear wise to themselves, but to others, but they weren't, right, on further examination, right? So there's that dichotomy there again. Now, what happens when he goes to visit the poets and talk to them? He's kind of excited because he's read some of their poetry, you know, and remember, these are like the creative type. So not just what you might be thinking of when you think of a poet, but anybody that creates. So he's probably talking to like the playwrights, people like a guy named Sophocles or Aristophanes or these guys that wrote comedies, tragedies. What happens when he talks to them? Who did the reading? Let's see. Does he, you know, he's impressed by the wisdom in their poetry, but does he find them wise when he discusses the poems with them? You guys, you can type it in the chat box or.
He was sort of like was led down because like they're like it's like he expected them like since like they were spoken the stories as if like they made them themselves, but in reality they're just telling them, like they're just
Right. Yeah. I mean, so he's disappointed. He expects them to be really interesting and have all this insight, but like you said, they don't. Right.
Yeah.
But then the way you characterized it, you said they're just telling stories. How are they able to tell a story that's full of wisdom if they don't have wisdom? How does that work? What does he think, or how does he explain this? Because that, you're right, that's kind of his encounter. He's like, yeah, they don't seem to understand anything about what they wrote. In fact, the bystanders, the people standing around that are, you know, hanging out, they seem to know and to understand the poems better than the people that wrote them, right? So if that's the case, the way you put it, they just tell stories, they don't know, they just speak or whatever. How do they do that? How are you able to tell a story without understanding it?
I think it's based more on their inborn talents and inspiration. So it's so it's from the moment, like a moment kind of thing. So they never really looked into it before they put it in. They just like, oh, this looks good, it sounds good, I'll put it in like that.
Right, those are the exact words that he uses. Well, at least like that's the English translation, right? Like some inborn talent, you know, as you said, or inspiration, right? So either they just have a way with words, you know, they're just able to say clever stuff, and sometimes they're not really even like sure, like they don't even understand the depth of what they said, or it's just something in the moment. They get this, I need to write this down. I don't even know what it is. Just here it comes, you know. And so I'll go ahead and read the passage where Socrates kind of describes this, you know, his encounter with the poets, right? He says, let's see, after the politicians, I went to the, and again, this is on not on 24. It's actually, sorry, it's on the next page. It's on page 25 of the handout. He says, after the politicians, I went to the poets, the writers of tragedies and dithyrambs. A dithyramb is just like a folk song to Dionysus, who was the god of wine. Don't worry, it's not important. But anyway, these were the, again, creative types, the writers, the poets, the artists, okay? So he went to them, intending in their case to catch myself being more ignorant than them. So I took up those poems with which they seemed to have taken most trouble, and I asked them what they meant, in order that I might at the same time learn something from them. I'm ashamed to tell you the truth, gentlemen, but I must. Almost all the bystanders might have explained the poems better than their authors could. I soon realized that poets do not compose their poems with knowledge, but by some inborn talent and by inspiration, like seers and prophets, who also say many fine things without any understanding of what they say. The poets seemed to me to have had a similar experience. At the same time, I saw that because of their poetry, they thought themselves very wise men in other respects, which they were not. So there again, I withdrew, and thinking that I had the same advantage over them that I had over the politicians. All right. So what is one of their big faults, right? So we've already established that they don't compose their poems with knowledge. Now he might be wrong about that, but that's his assumption, right? And he's saying they can't explain them, so they don't know what they're talking about. So they must do it with just inspiration, with just inborn talent. And if that's the case, would you say that they're wise? What do you think? Like, yeah, go ahead.
It doesn't mean that they're wise. It's more so like they have a talent for it.
Yeah, they're good. They're talented. They have a skill at maybe using language if you're the writer, or painting if you're a painter. But when it comes to conveying truth, when it comes to conveying wisdom, and actually understanding the wisdom that you're conveying, they're completely deficient, right? So by Socrates standards, they're not wise. It's sort of like, imagine if I gave a lecture on brain surgery. Thank goodness I'm not going to do that, right? But if I memorized this lecture on how to perform brain surgery, and it was filled with all these medical terms that I didn't know what they even meant, right? But it was a good lecture. The lecture was accurate. It told you how to do brain surgery correctly. Everything was all good, but I didn't understand it. I just memorized it, and I was able to give this speech, right? Do I have wisdom? Do I have knowledge of brain surgery in that case? What do you think? Yes, no, maybe so.
No.
No, right? No, not at all. Right? It's I'm just regurgitating facts, so that the facts are true, but I have no understanding of them, so I don't have the wisdom, right? Yeah, somebody said just copy and paste, LOL. Yeah, exactly, right. I think, and maybe I'm being a bit too harsh, but I feel like educators, at least in this country, tend to forget this fact, and I think students do too, and they kind of approach education as just memorizing a bunch of facts. And just, I go to school, and they get angry when a teacher doesn't lecture. They're like, why do I have to talk? You just tell me the answer. Just tell me, and it's like, I'm not doing you any favors if I just give you the answer, right? It's better that you think and learn how to make these judgments on your own, right? So you have this understanding of it, right? On the other hand, I kind of want to come to the defense of the poets here, right? Before I do, though, let's mention one other thing he talks about. Because they are able to write such great poems, and because maybe they have a lot of prestige, or they're well known in the city, how does that affect them? How does that make them become? How do they see themselves?
They
They're
probably
turning into somewhat of celebrities within the city.
Well, they're celebrities. So how do you think you would feel if you were like a celebrity and everybody was telling you all day how awesome you were, how great you were, how wise you were? What might you start thinking?
Yeah,
You might get cocky, someone said, boastful, right? You might start believing this stuff, right? So that's what he says happens to them, right? He says, at the same time, I saw that because of their poetry, they thought themselves very wise men in other respects, right? So they got, because they're able to write, oh yeah, I'm awesome, I'm so great. And for him, they were deceiving themselves, right? That was them being unaware of their ignorance. Unlike him, Socrates, who knows when he doesn't know something. So, but again, like I said a second ago, I want to slightly come to the defense of the poets. Isn't it possible maybe that there are works of art that don't have just one explanation or one simple explanation or something like this? Couldn't an artist say, look, I was expressing something, and if you interpret it that way, that's great. Like, I don't want to get in the way of that. Maybe I'm being a bit modern. That's a very modern sort of approach to
No, that's happened before. There's been plenty of authors who have actually learned things about their own books or like a movie or something
exactly.
that they didn't think of before.
Right.
So
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I've heard it myself in interviews. You know, I know one that comes to mind. There's an author, Hermann Hesse, who wrote a book called Steppenwolf, and Steppenwolf is a very controversial book. It has a lot of sex and drugs and all this, and all the hippies liked it, all the hippies and the beatniks in the '60s, and he didn't like that because he says that was not really the point of the book. You know, it wasn't just like go have fun, and that wasn't my point. But when he writes this introduction, I think to like the 20th anniversary or 50th or whatever edition, and he says, look, man, once I make a work of art, you get something out of it. It's kind of like, and he says, and even I myself have approached it differently. So even though at first I didn't like this, Darkseid's brother, I don't know who Darkseid is. I'm sure that Steppenwolf, it's the book Steppenwolf is from the 1920s, right? It was published in 1927, but there was a band.
They're talking about the superhero movie.
It's a what? It's a superhero movie? That's what I figured.
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured it was a character.
I didn't mean to type that in. I just thought of it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, but there was actually a band in the 1960s, like this old like rock and roll. They were considered like the creators of heavy metal. But if you listen to them, you're like, that's heavy metal. Like, I guess it's kind of hard for the '60s. But they call themselves Steppenwolf, right? They had that song, "Born to Be Wild." Maybe you know it. Born to Be Wild. Anyway, Steppenwolf, it had a big cultural influence, a big impact, especially on counterculture, the rebels, the hippies. They love that book. But the author was like, he didn't like the response, but even he was sort of like, look, man, I'm not going to jump in. If you got something out of it like that, that's you. I'm almost like flattered that my work got so many different reactions, but again, maybe I'm approaching art in a very modern way. The Greeks, around Plato's time, they weren't really looking at art in the same way I think that a lot of us do, as something as this thing that can be open to interpretation and can be a part of just personal expression. For them, they use the word mimesis. I'll type it in here in the chat box. The Greek word mimesis means to mimic, to copy, to imitate, right? So art was just a form of imitation. So you just, somebody said copy and paste, right? Like art is copy and pasting nature, right? Like an artist will, sculpt a human body, but the human body is a part of nature. So he's just copying it with his, with his chisel, he's chipping away at the marble and sculpting, a copy of the real thing, right? So good art is a good copy, bad art is a bad copy, right? There was a little bit more to it than that, but that was kind of the gist of the Greek approach to art. And so that also might give you an idea of why, and we'll talk about this more later, Plato seemed a bit anti-art. Like he seemed to think that art in general and artists were not to be trusted, that they were deceptive, right? If art is a copy, right? If a painting of a horse is the copy of an actual real horse, then it's removed from what's real and what's true. And so therefore it's misleading and you should sort of avoid all this like fanciful art because it leads you away from truth and reason and order, which is kind of ironic because I would argue that Plato was a pretty good artist in the sense that he's a pretty decent writer. He's pretty compelling. Well, so I don't know if he follows his own rules. But anyway, enough about the poets, right? I think we've talked enough about them, right? They think they know everything, just like the politicians do, but at least they write good poems. At least Socrates will give them that. The problem is they don't have the knowledge. Oh, one last thing, and this is another interesting point. Maybe this is something that's, I think, still pretty controversial in the history of philosophy. Even today, you've got philosophers that will be debating over this. If you're not able to explain something to somebody, does that necessarily mean that you don't understand it or that you don't know it? For instance, think about it this way. Let's say my last class, my earlier class today, I had a student who was giving the example of somebody who's a martial artist, right? So what if you practice martial arts? you know, like just let's say Kung Fu or whatever, right? So you're learning Shaolin Kung Fu, and you study it for years and for years, and you become like a master, a Kung Fu master, and you're able to like fight very well against all these different opponents and prove your skill. But let's say you're just not a really good teacher, right? Like you're not able to explain how you do what you do. Does that necessarily mean you're not wise in Kung Fu? There's some, like, I remember I had philosophy professors and other philosophy students, I remember we would talk about this, they would claim that if you can't explain it clearly to someone else in a way that that person can understand it, then you don't fully understand it, right? And I don't know if is that really, I mean, I used to sort of buy into that and think that that kind of was right, but, you know, I'm just curious, does anybody have any thoughts on that? Like, do you guys, go ahead.
I kind of agree that I think to at least some extent, if you can't break down something
right
and explain it, that you probably don't know how you're even doing it. I think there's a difference between having the talent to be able to do something or mimic something, or if that makes any sense, but
no,
not
totally
to like break it down and explain it, like sports and stuff. Like you can play a sport, but if you can't explain how you did what you just did, then you probably don't really understand.
So you have a skill, but you don't have knowledge, right? If we had Aristotle, we're not going to cover him in this class. I might bring him up. I guess we'll bring him out now. It would be helpful because Aristotle distinguishes between two types of knowledge. You've got sort of this intellectual wisdom or intellectual knowledge, theoretical, and then you've got practical, right? So he would say that, no, you're wrong. The athlete does have knowledge, but it's practical knowledge. They're able to practice their sport. They've got a good skill, but they don't have the intellectual. They're not able to explain it in words. They can't conceptualize it or whatever, right? But it seems like Plato, he seems to emphasize that second, the theoretical. And if you don't have that, then it doesn't count. It doesn't count as wisdom. It doesn't count as knowledge. Somebody says we know what we think and feel, but sometimes we can't explain it. Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe some things too can't really be put into a formula, right? So I forgot the guy's name. I need to memorize this dude's name, but he was a famous baseball player who was like almost a perfect pitcher. You know, he had so many no-hitters, right? That's when you don't get nobody hits the ball the whole game, right? During baseball. And there's a story about him where, you know, he had a weird stance and he had a weird way of throwing, I think. And he was being interviewed one time, and the guy pointed it out to him and said, so how did you develop that stance? What did you do to figure out that way of throwing would be so effective? And the guy was like, what way of standing, you know? And he didn't know. And then he started thinking about it, and he started looking at videos of himself pitching. And this is really tragic. From that point on, he sucked as a pitcher. He lost his whole, like, it was like he was in his head, you know? It kind of reminds me when I used to take piano lessons. I was trying to be a music major for a while, and I had to learn like classical piano and reading music. So I tried, you know, and failed miserably. I picked up a bit. I was able to read a little bit and play some chords and scales. But anyway, I would go to my practice once a week, and I remember my teacher would always tell me, like, whenever I had been really studying and practicing and really practicing every day throughout the week, whenever I came to class, I would be like really nervous, and I would kind of mess up and be all stiff because I'd be in my head thinking about all the hard work I'd put in over the week and how I wanted to impress my teacher. Look what I did. But usually when I had like a real stressful week and I'd been, you know, had a lot of school or work or whatever, and I just didn't have much time to practice, I would go to my lesson and I would just be kind of like, oh, whatever. And I would actually do better. She's like, yeah, it's like when I didn't care, when I didn't think about it so much. So, but again, you know, I'm digressing a bit. There's like this distinction between like theoretical knowing, which I think, I forgot who it was that jumped in, she was talking about the sports person. They don't have the theory, but they know how to be a good player, right? So maybe that's what's going on. But let's move on. Let's move on to the craftsman, because I think that actually has a little bit to do with theoretical knowledge too. I want to avoid reading like this whole thing, so let's try to see if we can get this out of the class. What happens when he engages with the craftsman? I think that he is the nicest to them. They're still not perfect, but he has some good things to say about them. What is his encounter with them like? Did they have any wisdom? Did they have any knowledge for him, or what? What do you think?
He believes that they wise at their own craft.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's all. Period. Like, full stop. They're wise at their craft. Okay. And the word, I guess should give you this just a fun tidbit. I will actually be using this word a bit throughout our exploration of Greek philosophy. The word is techne. I just typed it there in the chat. That last E is supposed to have an accent, right? Techne. It means skill, craft, discipline, something like this. Reminded me, somebody just wrote, this reminded me of how Giannis forgot how to shoot now that he's MVP, LOL. Man, I'm ignorant when it comes to sports, but yeah, I probably would have remembered that guy's name I was talking about if I wasn't such a, I'm weird. I don't really follow sports at all. I like to go see a game every once in a while, but I guess that's out of the question right now for obvious reasons. But anyways, yeah, like you're right. The craftsmen knew their craft. They knew their techne. They knew their skill, their discipline. But what was wrong with them? Similar thing with the poets, I guess. But someone say it. What's because they were so wise at their craft? What did they assume that was wrong?
They believed they was wise at all other pursuits, since they was wise in their own craft.
Right. So they're very good. Like, let's say they're a really good mechanic. So they're like, oh, well, I know how to fix anything mechanical. I should be the king of the city, right? This is the sort of attitude that they develop, right? And I got to say, I think this is a real thing. This is a real psychosis. I don't know if that's the proper use of that term, but it seems like this happens to a lot of us, myself included. We're all human. When we get really good at whatever it is that we specialize in, we tend to elevate the importance of that thing, and we also tend to over-exaggerate its application to other things, right? So, for instance, I remember when I was working in grocery, right? I used to work at Whole Foods for years, almost 9 years I worked there. This was, when I was still going to undergraduate. And, I stopped working there in 2003, so it's been years. But anyway, I'd worked there so long that I'd pretty much worked every department. I was a meat cutter. I was a butcher, worked in the meat department, but I had filled in and helped out, when they were shorthanded or whatnot in other departments. So I had kind of an idea, and I knew a lot of the people in all the other departments. It was a real social atmosphere. But I found it interesting. Every person in that store, no matter whether you were a baker or a cashier or if you worked in the produce department, everyone thought their job was the hardest. Everyone thought that their job was the hardest and that they could do the other ones easy, right? Somebody just put something, he says, same when you believe in certain things, politics, you start to identify in that context. Right, so, yeah, I mean, if I'm getting your point right, you start hanging out with other people who also share your beliefs. So, like you're mentioning politics, faith. If you're a Republican or a Democrat and all you do is hang out with other people who also share your beliefs, right? But I think to get more precise, he's talking about specialists, right? So these people do have knowledge. He'll admit that. Like, they know their craft, right? They're not idiots when it comes to building a ship or whatever. But where the idiot part is where they think just because they're good at that they're good at anything else, right? When really they probably just don't have any idea of what it's like. Back to my Whole Foods story, when I was my last year there, I transferred to the front end where you just, you're a cashier, bag groceries, whatever. And everybody up there was like, Travis, why are you up here? Like, aren't you in the meat department? I'm like, yeah, well, I was getting stressed out. I was a shift leader, by that time. So I had all these responsibilities, and working in the meat department is hard work. I don't know if anybody here's done it, but it's physically intensive and it's mentally intensive because you have perishable product. It's going to go out of date. How are you going to sell it, or are you going to sell it? How are you going to make your margins? But anyways, it's not an easy job, but they assumed it was. They're like, why would you want to work on the front end, right? And I told them, I was like, it was stressful back there. I'm going to school full time. I'm working. And they would be like, it's harder to work there than here. Like they couldn't fathom that being a butcher was harder than being a cashier. Again, they just didn't know, because it is hard to be a cashier. It's annoying. You get annoying customers and you have to memorize all the produce codes, and it's not easy. But if I had to pick, maybe I'm biased because I was a butcher for so long, but still, it's definitely obvious they had no idea. They think the steaks cut themselves or something like that. So again, the craftsmen have this unawareness of sort of how they fit, right, in the whole scheme of things. Yes, you're important. We need buildings. We need ships. We need that. But ruling a city is more than that. There's more to it than that. I feel like today we do this in politics a lot with, especially with businessmen. If you're good in business and you're rich and you made a lot of money, then you must be a good leader, right? And I think that's bullshit. Sorry, but I mean, you might. It depends on what kind of businessman you are, right? But people seem to equate success, with just making money. So if you make money, you must be successful. You must be smart. But a lot of things that work in business don't work in politics, right? You're not here to make a profit when you're the president, or maybe you are, but that's not what they're supposed to. That's what they're supposed to be doing, right? So I think this is a real thing. So he says, I admire their wisdom, I admire their techne, right? But their arrogance is just overwhelming, and I'm not going to have any of it. I'd rather be where I'm at, not knowing their techne, but not being arrogant either, right? So how does he sum this all up, right? He's kind of done telling his story. What does he conclude? Is there a way to kind of briefly summarize? How does he interpret now the oracle saying? Why did the oracle say that there are none wiser than Socrates? Is there a way to briefly summarize that? Why did the god say he's the wisest? What's the...
Because he knows he knows his limits. Like he's not arrogant.
Right. He knows what he doesn't know. Right. Where
he understands his wisdom is worthless.
Yeah, there you go. You said it, but somebody else was going to say something as well. I don't know if y'all caught that last line, but anybody else want to jump in?
I think it's because he knows to ask questions. Like, he doesn't believe in himself. Like, he doesn't believe that he is the wisest. He believes that there are some things in the world that he needs to know about. Like, he needs to ask questions. So
he doesn't make assumptions. He doesn't presume, right? And I think we all do this, right? We use words like justice, like that wasn't just, and we have a feeling like we know what that means. But if somebody were to make us provide a definition, we might not have a really good definition. We might not have actually thought this through. So he's like, look, man, I'm aware of this. And that's the only thing that makes me special. And really, for him, it's not special. There's really nothing special about him. Any one of us can be just as wise as he is, right? All we have to do is acknowledge that we're not wise. Kind of ironic. And somebody said that human wisdom is worthless. That's how he puts it, right? The God means that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And so Socrates is a good example. He recognizes it. He has humility, right? He's humble about this. Some think he's not sincere. They think he's he really is full of himself, but he's just pretending to be humble. But this is the story that he's trying to tell, right? Let's read here. He's going to sum it up. This is on page, I think it's on page 26. Page 26. that first full paragraph. He says, as a result of this investigation, men of Athens, I acquired much unpopularity of a kind that is hard to deal with and is a heavy burden. Many slanders came from these people, and also a reputation for wisdom. For in each case, the bystanders thought that I myself possessed the wisdom that I proved that my interlocutor did not have. What is probable, gentlemen, is that in fact the god is wise, and that his oracular response meant that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And that when he says this man Socrates, he's just using my name as an example. As if he said, this man among you mortals is wisest, who, like Socrates, understands that his wisdom is worthless. So even now, I continue this investigation as the god bade me, and I go around seeking out anyone, citizen or stranger, whom I think wise. And then if I don't think he's wise, I come to the assistance of the god, and I show him that he is not wise. And because of this occupation, I do not have the leisure to engage in any public affairs to any extent, nor indeed to look after my own. But I live in great poverty because of my service to the god. So this is kind of the end of, I would call this kind of the first part of his defense. And this is where he explains, right? And you all pretty much said it, yeah, good enough. He realizes that he's not wise. He knows that he's not knowledgeable. And so that's what makes him kind of paradoxical almost. That's what makes him smarter than all these others. But what is the point of this story in the context of the trial? You know, remember, he's on trial and he's trying to defend himself. At least that's what we're supposed to believe. How is this story a defense? Or is it? Maybe it isn't. Let's remind ourselves first what the charges are. We went over this last time, but someone help me out. Why is he on trial? What's he being accused of?
Impiety.
So impiety, that's one of them, right? He's not respecting the gods. But what's the other?
Corrupting the children, or
right? Good.
Yeah.
So he's corrupting the youth of Athens, right? Has he addressed those charges, do you think? Or I mean,
well, if he's doing the work of the gods, and in fact doing the work of the wisest god, or at least that's what he's claiming,
right?
Then isn't what he's doing, quote unquote, right?
Good.
Isn't what he's doing something to be valued?
Right. No, you caught it. Usually people don't catch it. Yeah, but you caught it. I think it's, I think, yes, he's characterizing this investigation as like a holy mission, right? He says, the god bade me, right? He commanded me. And even though I'm getting all these people angry at me and I suffer, I'm in poverty, I don't have time to look after I'm doing it because the god wants me to. The god wants me to do this. So yeah, he seems to be characterizing this as a holy mission, and that's super pious, right? That's not impious,
It also comes across like another version of that. Humans don't understand the whims of the gods type thing. Is like people are angry at what he's doing, and he's claiming to be on some kind of like clandestine mission,
right?
Life mission,
right?
And he's all like, and he's also talking about how human wisdom is worthless. He's kind of like, even though he's not arrogant, he's twisting it in a way where it's like, look, our wisdom is nothing compared to the whims of the gods, and yet here I am on a mission of the gods. So whether you understand me or not, I'm on the right path, or something like that.
Right. I didn't even think about it that way, but yeah, I guess when he says that, human wisdom is worth little or nothing, that's very humbling. That's elevating the gods. That's not denigrating them. So yeah, that's a good point too. So I think in a certain sense, he is directly addressing that charge of impiety. But what else do you think he's doing here? Because I think he's doing something else that might be kind of effective as a defense, right? And I'll give you a hint. The three people that are named as his accusers, Melitus, Anytus, Lysone, each of them represent these three groups, right? The politicians, the poets, the craftsmen. So why else do you think he's telling us this story? What's the point also?
Maybe
Go
to
ahead.
discredit. He's trying to discredit them?
Yes, yeah, but how does that story discredit them? What does it make them look like? So, if you're a poet, if you're a politician, let's say, and you have a lot of influence and power and people look up to you, and this guy Socrates comes around and makes you look like an idiot, what might you do with your power? If
Try to get rid of him.
Try to what?
To get rid of him?
Yeah, try to get rid of the guy. So I think he's like, he's establishing that they're biased, right? That, look, I didn't do all this stuff they said. I just made them look like idiots. I made them look stupid, right? And now their pride is hurt. Their pride is injured. And here they are to put me on trial, right? Simple as that, right? They're not sincere, right? And he doesn't come out and say it, but I think that's one of the reasons he keeps bringing up the fact that they don't like him, they dislike him. And to be honest, I know that we're supposed to take his side, and Plato kind of portrays him as the good guy. And in general, I kind of am on his side. But you got to sort of be able to relate a little bit to the other, the opponents. This guy might have been a pretty annoying person to be around. Socrates might not have been the most pleasant. Imagine you're a craftsman. Imagine you're a blacksmith or something, right? You're sitting in your workshop one day, pounding away at the steel, fire everywhere. It's hot. You're sweaty. You've got all this work piled up. And then all of a sudden you smell this smelly BO, and you're like, oh, hey, Socrates. Yeah, he didn't bathe very much. We'll talk about that when we get to the symposium. But here's this dude who's like, what is justice? And you're like, Socrates, really? Right now? I got all this stuff to do. I got to make this battle axe. I got this shield to do after lunch, man. Can you come back later and talk about justice? And he's like, I guess that your job is more important than justice, huh? And you're like, all right, Socrates, fine. Let's talk about justice, right? So you answered.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say they could turn it on him, and that's
what I was leading up to. I was leading up to his typical approach is to ask you what justice is and then tear holes in your definition like Swiss cheese, right? Oh, that can't be justice. And like you said, you cut to the chase. A good tactic is to turn the tables and be like, well, what do you think justice is? But here's the annoying part. What's he going to say to that?
That he doesn't know.
Right. No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking you, right?
Which in turn discredits him because it ultimately feels like he's not saying anything at all.
Right. It seems like he's just a critic that's just nitpicky and has nothing to say, right? So I can see how that's annoying. There's people like this who they're just argumentative people, right? I think he's aware of this, though. He brings this up, and I don't think we're going to get this far this time, but there's a famous metaphor he uses of a gadfly. He calls himself the gadfly. So he knows he's annoying, but he seems to think that this is a service. He has to do it. And he knows, look, I know it's annoying. I don't know what justice is, and I'm acting like I'm this, authority on it, poking holes in your definition. But I'm making you think. I'm making you think critically. I'm exposing the fact that you've never thought of these things in any depth, and you've just taken all these things for granted. I know it's annoying, but it's a service to you, right? This is sort of Socrates' defense.
The problem is that even if, it's great to ask questions. I'm never one to think that, one side is completely right or completely wrong, or there's pros and cons to a lot of things, a lot of shades of gray. But ultimately, you need to, I think, classes before, I brought up some kind of universal standard, or at least you have to have some kind of footing to then create something, because right now he's asking questions but he has no place to go to, or and he's not really starting from anything that he believes. So the best things tend to come from a place of compromise, and right now it's mostly questions and questions and questions.
Right.
So it's if you're trying to get rid of these people, what would you replace them with? You don't know?
Maybe I think you got a really good point against Socrates here. I feel like maybe I'm not being fair to him, but eventually we'll get to another dialogue. But I think it's easy to see Socrates as just a skeptic of everything if you just read the Apology, right? And I think if that's the case, then you've got a good point. It's sort of like you got to have something you stand up for. You got to have something to live for, right? And he doesn't seem to have any answers. I mean, it's fine to question things. It's fine, but you need a compass. You need something, right? He does. He does have something, right? And we're not going to have time.
Even if you change it, even if you change what you stand on, too, it's like
right.
He does like because based on this, because I generally do agree with Socrates, but based on this defense of him.
Right.
Of himself, it's like ultimately it seems like he's just like it seems like he's not in a haze, but that's what it feels like.
Right.
You have all these different ideas flowing together with no end point.
Well, I think to maybe put it in a historical context, you know, I don't want to do too much history, right, and get sidetracked, but you know, there's one way to interpret Socrates as, you know, a necessary annoyance because of the climate in Athens at the time, right? So for history buffs, you know, if you know anything about the history of the Peloponnesian War, that was one of the very first history books ever by Thucydides, early Greek historian. Well, you know, this time period that Plato and Socrates are writing in takes place right after that war, and that war was a long, drawn-out war. It's one where Athens started out thinking they were going to win, and they were overconfident. They thought they were the bomb. They had the strongest military in the world. They just defeated the Persians. And then the Spartans, who were also a part of the Greek alliance, they didn't like the way Athens was running things. They thought Athens was too full of themselves and was demanding too much payment for navy protection. So they had a big fight, and ultimately the Spartans kicked their ass. I mean, it took a long time, but the Spartans won. They took over their city. They ruled their city for years. It was called the time of the 30 Tyrants. And Plato is writing right after the democracy is restored to Athens, after those tyrants have left. And I think there's one way to interpret Socrates as a reaction, because Socrates feels like Athens has fallen from greatness. Like they were really great when they were fighting against the Persian Empire, and when, you know, at the early stages of there's a golden age of Athens. But now that there's the Sophists have shown up, and the Spartans have corrupted things, and everything's become so corrupt, that Athens is not as awesome as they thought they were. Like they used to be great, but they're not great anymore. They still believe that they are. And so Socrates is this man who he's a patriot. He loves his city, but he sees that it's arrogant, that it's become like the people that he talks to, the city as a whole has become full of themselves, has overestimated, and so he's there to knock them down, right? So I think your point is I still take your point. You know, it's like you got to have some guiding principle, but I think his guiding principle is like, well, before we even get to that, let's clear the floor here, and let's sort of like, I guess maybe take inventory of what we can know and what we can assert. And we're asserting a lot more than we can, right? And so I think he comes.
Sounds like the original Descartes.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, there's some parallels between the sort of the Cartesian questioning and the Socratic questioning. You know, always like, well, why, right? Digging deeper and that sort of thing. But we'll learn more about Descartes later. I better just put a pin on that one and move on. But yeah, so this next part of the dialogue, right? This is the one that I think is kind of weak. I call this the cross-examination of Melitus. So Melitus, I guess I'll type his name in here in the sidebar. You know, Melitus is one of his accusers. I think he represents the politicians. It's not important, but he's one of the accusers, right? And he doesn't come off very clever in this exchange. Nonetheless, I do think that Socrates makes some pretty bold assertions that are kind of flimsy. Even though Melitus comes off kind of like a fool, a moron, and doesn't look very good, I think that Socrates makes some pretty bad arguments here. We'll see what you think, though. Let's look at some of these arguments. Now, this first section of the cross-examination is not so much an argument, and I think it's actually pretty effective. What he does is he just starts asking Melitus questions about corruption, right? Because remember, that was one of the other charges. It seems like he's already addressed more or less the charge of impiety, right? Now he's going to turn to this charge of corrupting the youth. And so he goes to Melitus and he says, so you say I'm corrupting the youth, Melitus. That's a very serious charge. So good for you, right? If it's true, good for you for turning me in. If anyone's corrupting the youth, they should be stopped. But I'm curious, Melitus, you seem to know so much about corruption. And if you know what's so bad for the youth, you know what corrupts the youth, then certainly you have to know what is good for them. You must know what the opposite is, right? And so tell us, Melitus, please let us know. Let everybody hear your explanation. Who is it exactly? You say I harm the youth, but who is it exactly that improves the youth? Who makes them better, right? And what does this guy say? What does Melitus say in response to Socrates? Who improves the youth? Nobody got that far in the reading?
Repeat that again.
I was asking, when he asks Melitus, who is it that improves the youth? Who makes them better? You know, Melitus says that Socrates makes them worse. Who makes them better? What does Melitus say to that?
He says, doesn't he say like he does and all the people in the like not Congress but in the political party and stuff
No,
like
he
that?
said everybody. He said every Athenian. Yeah. I mean, it's a very long, drawn out exchange. He's very hesitant. At first, he says something like the laws improve.
Yeah, he says the laws.
And Socrates is like, Melitus, you know what I mean. I didn't say what. I said who. What people or what group of people. And even then, Melitus is like kind of hesitant. So Socrates has to like point to the jury. And he's like, how about the jury? All the guys on the jury, they improve the youth? And Melitus is like, yeah, they improve the youth. And then he's like, well, what about everybody that's here? All the people that are assembled here today to watch the trial. Do they improve the youth? Yeah, they do too. Okay, well, how about the people that aren't here? Like all the Athenians that couldn't make it, that are out of town or whatever, have other things to do. Or do they improve the youth? And he says yes. So apparently everybody improves the youth, according to Melitus, except for Socrates. Do you think that that's true? Or do you even think he believes that? Do you think Melitus even believes what he's saying?
I don't think he does. I think he was more so just saying it for the trial.
Yeah, I don't think he believes it.
Yeah, he was explaining how Socrates goes to explain how like you think one man like is corrupting all of the youth, and I think that explains it perfectly. It's like one person can't corrupt all of the youth.
It's just very improbable. It's just so improbable. I mean, if there's, I don't know how many people were in ancient Athens, but it was in the thousands, you know. You're telling me out of thousands of people, there's only one man that's bad for kids to hang out with? Only one? What a great society. Let's go move there, right? It just seems very unlikely, right? You think most of the people standing around there buy into that? Do they think he's really speaking the truth? Maybe they're really stupid. I don't think so. I think most of them are probably like, oh, he's just saying that. But why? Why would he just say that? If it's not true, and it's probably obviously, why would he say that? Why would he not be honest? Why would he not? Go ahead.
Because he's biased.
He's biased, yeah. Well, I think this is what.
And desperate.
What's that?
And desperate, maybe.
Desperate, yeah. That's a good way to put it. I think him being biased is the whole point of the exchange. Like, that's why Socrates is asking him all these questions, because he knows the way the guy's going to answer, and he knows it's going to be ridiculous, and it's going to show that he's biased, right? It's like, dude, how likely is it that I'm the only one that corrupts the youth? That's really unlikely. There's got to be others. So he's just saying that. So why isn't he honest? Well, if he were honest, you know, he wants to get Socrates in trouble, right? He wants to get the guy convicted. If Socrates asks him, hey, how about everybody on the jury? And he looks over to the jury and he's thinking to himself, you know, most of those guys are pretty good. Oh, except for that one guy. That guy's sleazy. Oh, and that guy's a piece of crap. I wouldn't let him hang out with my sister. Why, if he was thinking that, why wouldn't he want to say it? Why would he just come out and say it? Why wouldn't he be like, you know, Socrates, that guy's kind of a jerk too. That guy's corrupting too. Oh, and that guy in the crowd's pretty corrupting. Why isn't he just honest?
Because he'll lose any leg to stand on.
Exactly. Well, he'll offend people. He'll alienate the crowd, right? So right here, he's not speaking truthfully. He's just telling them what they want to hear, right? You know, it's like a politician, right? If the politician is at the police union, they're going to say all this great stuff about cops, you know. Oh, my dad was a police, and I love the police, and y'all risk your lives to save the community. Yes, the police, all police are good. Every police is a good person. You all are great, right? But then he goes to the Black Lives Matter rally, and he's like, oh, these police are corrupt, and, you know, so he's appealing to the crowd, right? And he can't even say anything negative about anybody, because for all he knows, you know, if he says that somebody in the audience is a jerk, you know, for all he knows that someone on the jury, that's his friend, right? So as you put it, you know, he's just kind of trying to sound good and to sugarcoat everything and get people on his side, right? And saying whatever it takes to do that. And this is pretty apparent, I think, in the rest of this trial when Socrates continues to question him. But like I said, I honestly think that some of this stuff is pretty weak. I think that if Socrates would have stopped right here, it would have been stronger. Because I think, honestly, I think there's a couple more arguments he's got, but I don't know, man. I think they're kind of flimsy. We'll see. You know, you see what you think. The next thing he does is he makes this claim that there's no way he's corrupting the youth, right? Either he's not doing it, or he is, but he's unaware, that he's ignorant, that he's not aware that he's doing it, right? Does anybody remember, you get this far in the reading, what's his basic argument? How does he argue that either he doesn't corrupt the youth or he does it unknowingly? Why does he say that? What's his evidence for that? What's his argument?
He says that he isn't necessarily teaching the youth and that they're just spectators to him questioning the other people, and that they're finding almost entertainment in it, or like they're believing what he's saying and finding interest in him questioning these people and almost like finding truth in it. And so he's not necessarily like telling them like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. That's not the full argument though. So he says, so I hang out with the youth. They're the ones that follow me around, right? But he starts off like the first thing, like I guess the first premise that he offers, you know, he asks Melitus. He says, "Does anybody want to be corrupted?" And Melitus is like, "No, like surely, right? Nobody wants to be corrupted." Okay. And to me, like there's no problem there. I'll give him that premise. I won't push back on that one, right? Yeah, sure. No one wants to be corrupted. Everyone wants to be improved, whatever. But then he says, well, what happens if you associate with people who are corrupt? What will happen to you? What's most likely to happen to someone who associates? You'll become corrupt. Good. And then there's your point, which is also part of the argument. Well, who does he hang out with? Who does he associate with? The youth, the kids, okay? So if you add all that up, no one wants to be corrupt. If you hang out with corrupt people, you become corrupt. He hangs out with the youth. And so what would happen if he corrupted the youth? If he corrupts them and he hangs out with them, what would happen to him?
He would be improved?
He would not be improved. He would be corrupted, right?
Oh, come, yeah.
Yeah, like his corruption would bounce off of them and stick to him, right? So he would corrupt them, and then by hanging out with them, he would become corrupt by default or whatever, right? So I mean, the basic argument is, no one wants to be corrupted. If you hang out with corrupt people, you'll become corrupted. I, Socrates, hang out with the young people. So if I corrupt them, I would be corrupted. And since nobody wants to be corrupted, why would I do that? Either I don't do it at all, right? Or I do it, but I'm not aware of it, right? I wouldn't knowingly corrupt myself. Why do I think this is a really weak, flimsy argument? To me, I think it's fairly strong. If you change the word associate, he says if nobody would corrupt their associates, right? Knowingly. That's part of his argument. But to me, it's that seems false. Like if you change the word associate to friend, family, someone you care about, maybe that would be true. You don't want to corrupt your friends. You don't want to, harm and corrupt your family.
I mean, but does he see these people as friends and family?
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
People?
Yeah, like
yeah. Corrupt is subjective. Like to them, they think him making all these people question things is corrupt, and he thinks that believing in whatever is true to you is corrupt.
Right.
But there seems to be very little middle ground. It seems to be two extremes.
No, in a way, it seems like you made a really good point. I was going to kind of like gloss over that and ignore it, but that is a really good point. He seems to be breaking his own rules and kind of taking for granted what the word corruption means, right? That we all know it, and like I'm not doing it, right? And so I don't know though if his argument like rests or stands on that though, because I would say it's like however you perceive corruption, you don't really want to be it. But even then, I think he's wrong. Because I think there are people who are corrupt, who know they are corrupt, who relish in being corrupt, and do all they want. They corrupt other people all the time who they associate with, right?
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
Or he could accidentally make people worse. So, like, if he says that.
Well, in that case, if it's an accident, I think that's what he's trying to say. If I do it, it's an accident. Does he deserve to be? Go ahead.
I mean, but intent, like, and I'm not. I mean, this day of sensitivity, but like, even if lack of intention doesn't completely absolve you of something. So it's like if you're not knowingly doing it, but you still did something that negatively affects other people, the part of the blame still affects rests on you. So let's say there's some person who could be great for Athens, and this person's on a path and making things like I guess you could say better than they were before, but then they started thinking like Socrates, and that foundation they stood on suddenly crumbles because now there's holes in everything.
Right.
So it's like ultimately, like him, the way that like you said, the way he's using corruption is like it kind of makes him hit it turns it back. He's turning it on himself, which makes it a pointless argument.
No, it's interesting though, because like you make a very similar point to this. The student last class made a very similar point, which I think is a good point against his argument. I think let me try to characterize it a bit to make it more sympathetic, but then kind of bring up your point, which I think is a pretty darn good one. But it's sort of, I think he's trying to say like, look, if I'm doing something wrong, like let's say you had a friend who was doing something wrong or harmful or how you want to put it, but your friend didn't know it was harmful, right? Would you go tell on them? Would you be like, I'm going to go call the cops on you, right? He says, no, you shouldn't. You should pull them aside and explain to them, hey, what you're doing is wrong, and correct you, right? So, you know, if he is corrupting the youth, you should say, hey, Socrates, look what you're doing. See how this is corrupting the youth? And he'll be, oh, my bad, I'll stop, right? But I think you make a pretty darn good point, and same point this other student made last class, that sometimes ignorance or good intent doesn't absolve you of, you know, I don't know, maybe you disagree. I don't know if you would agree with this part. He also said that it might lessen your penalty, right? So maybe we won't be as harsh on you, but it doesn't mean you're off the hook, right? So if you're corrupting the youth unknowingly, you still might need to be punished, but we might have to take that into consideration and not punish you as harshly as we would otherwise. But then I'm thinking,
yeah, I
go
agree
ahead.
with that.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Yeah, but
it's like how you look at the murder. Degrees of murder. So.
Oh, you took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, I was like, what about murder though? I didn't know killing someone was wrong. Like, I don't know how far I would. It makes sense, but you know, I don't know how far.
Like, but there's degrees, and then it goes into manslaughter.
Right.
Because intent does implies malice.
Right.
So it's like if there's no malice in it, then it's something that. I mean, I guess it's kind of a bad choice of words potentially, but like, like it could be like you could be fixed, or you could be re-educated, or you could be regulated a little. Like you could turn things down a little bit, and it wouldn't.
What's the word I'm looking for? You're able to be rehabilitated, or that's not the word. That's not the word I was looking for, but something like that, right? Like you're
maybe re-educated or something like that.
Re-educated. There you go. So something like that. So but again, I don't think this argument of his is all that solid. The reason I think it's not that solid is that premise that no one would intentionally corrupt their associates, especially using that word associate, which is such a broad word. Like anybody you happen to associate with, how many businesses have become corrupt because the associates were doing corrupt stuff together and we're well aware of it. So I think this is sort of a naive argument, and not.
I think it's the fact that he says no one, and that's an absolute something that you would assume that he wouldn't agree with.
Right. Good point. You know, in fact, this is something you need to keep in mind when you guys are writing your papers. You want to avoid these absolute statements unless it's something like, you know, super. I mean, I don't know why you would ever say something like this in a paper, but you know, nobody is awake who is also asleep. Okay, that one is true, right? That's universal. If you're awake, then you're not asleep, and if you're asleep, you're not awake. That's just how we define those terms. But you know, in general, if you say never, no one, or it's always the case, or everyone, usually there's a way to prove you wrong really easily. You know, all you gotta do is find one exception. So, you know, whenever he says no one wants to be corrupted, that's a pretty bold statement. And, you know, he hasn't read his Machiavelli. I guess he didn't have a time machine to travel to, you know, the 1600s Renaissance and read, you know, Machiavelli's The Prince, right? Where it's all about, you know, being corrupt and better to be feared than to be loved, and all this, you know, sinister ways of politicking, you know. So this is not it, though. There's one more argument. We're almost short on time, right? What if you're unwoke? LOL. Yeah, that's a good one. So we're really short on time, so I'm gonna have to kind of rush through this one. But there's one more thing that Melitus is sort of accused of by Socrates. Is, wait a minute, you're not even being consistent, Melitus. You say that I'm an atheist. You say I don't believe in the gods, but then you say that I teach of spiritual things, and that doesn't work, right? Because what do we mean by spiritual things, right? We either mean the gods, or we mean, well, who knows their Greek mythology? What were there besides gods and humans? Were there other beings in the Greek?
There was Titans, ones that came before.
Right. The Titans were the Titans were also gods. Like they were, but there was
some of them.
There was something in the middle between the gods and the humans. Who knows the word?
Demigods?
Yeah, the demigods. The demigod. He actually uses this funny phrase, the bastard children of gods. Which is, I guess,
technically not wrong.
Yeah, not wrong. Yeah, I mean, Zeus, he was not known as a good father figure for his demigod children, right? He didn't even pay child support, right? He'd go down and impregnate these beautiful maidens, and then he'd just split, right? Unfortunately, right? But Socrates says, look, you're saying I'm teaching about spiritual things, and yet I'm an atheist. How can that be true, right? Spiritual things are either gods or children of gods. You can't believe in gods or even the children of gods without believing in the gods themselves. So I can't be an atheist, right? Here's why I think, and I'm really rushing through this. I usually dwell on this a little bit longer, but we're pretty close to the end of class. We got 10 minutes, and I like to leave at least 5 or 10 minutes open for, you know, wrapping things up. So I'm kind of rushing through this argument. If you guys want to say anything about it, go ahead. But here's my issue with this whole argument against Melitus. again, maybe the Greek translation makes it weaker than it really is. If you read the Greek, maybe it's less ambiguous, and the wording makes it a stronger argument. But the way it's translated here, and I've read different translations, they pretty much come out like this: I teach about spiritual things, so I can't be an atheist. What do you mean? Isn't it possible to teach about spiritual things and not believe in them? Like, isn't that possible?
It is possible, but to me that's also irrelevant, because it's like you can teach about spiritual things and claim claim what you're saying is from the gods, but to other people who are potentially more devout than you, what you're saying could still be blasphemy. So it's like, so it still can be seen as impious, regardless of if you think you're speaking like spiritually.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, though, you might think that the spiritual things that the person is teaching are wrong, that they're not correct, but they're still spiritual things, right? And so, and haven't there been in history people who didn't believe what they were actually spewing, like what they were saying?
Osama bin Laden.
Right. I mean, yeah. There's like tons of examples. Like, I actually like to use like a less, I guess, sinister example. I actually know a person like this. Okay, I don't know him that well, and actually, I kind of like the guy in general, but this part about him kind of rubs me the wrong way. Even though I'm not religious, like, at all, this kind of offends me. He used to be Christian, okay, like really hardcore about it, like very devout. But he became a philosophy major. He studies philosophy for 2 or 3 years, and now he's atheist, okay? And here's the part that's kind of messed up, I think. He had been so active in his church his whole life, and he was a very good public speaker. So he would give all these talks on Christianity and Jesus and, the love of Jesus and all this. And he would make money doing this. Like, they would fly him all over the country to give speeches and put him up in hotels and all this stuff. He kept doing this for years, even after he'd lost his faith, And I mean, I remember when I first heard about this, I was like, dude, that's messed up, man. Like, how can...
That's one step away from being a politician.
Well, yeah. That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not that religious. I'm not religious at all, but like, I was like, that's messed up. I could not do that with a straight face, But honestly, like, the more I think about it, I'm kind of like, I still think he's kind of sleazy for doing that. But if he inspired people to live a good life and treat people well and to be responsible, and maybe the pros outweigh the cons. I don't know. I've kind of changed my tune on that. I guess I still think it's kind of sinister what he's doing. But
I mean, what if he? What if he's? Because there's a lot of different interpretations of the Bible, and lots of different people take different things. So maybe he I don't know if he is actually atheist, because if you could preach, or maybe he's just really good at talking. But it's like, if you could believe certain aspects and still fall out, but still like.
Point.
Yeah,
I never really discussed it with him, and maybe I should have, instead of like rushing to judgment. Maybe like you said, maybe he did believe some of the like my father. My father wasn't a very religious man, but he was raised a Christian, and he'd always tell me, he's like, well, I'm not really religious. He's like, but I do like the philosophy of Jesus Christ. Like, I think he's got a good moral philosophy, right? And so maybe like you said, maybe like he believed that part, like he believed the teachings. He might not have believed like the supernatural aspects. So he was able to speak with conviction because he had it. He did sincerely believe to some extent, right? And as you say, like there's a lot of different versions of Christianity. That book is open to so many interpretations that maybe he was able to justify that to himself. He's like, even an atheist can approach Christianity, and even though I don't believe in a deity, I can draw something from it, So to be fair to the guy, I guess, Go ahead.
I think it's not under religion, so it's basically like he knows this stuff, but he's not a Christian. So it's more on, like, I know stuff. I'm not a Christian, but I know the stuff, so I can share it because it's my own knowledge or something.
But that's, to me, I would have been happy if he would have told the people that, but he didn't. He had them believing that he was also a Christian. You know, that's the part I was like, that's messed up. You know,
Well, that's the messed up one.
But-
The part, yeah, that's the messed
yeah,
up.
that part, like, that's messed up. It's like,
I mean,
it's one thing to be like,
yeah.
look, I used to be a Christian, I'm still not one, but I respect the tradition, and I'm here to give you a talk about it, and to explore it, and I hope you enjoy it. That's fine, no problem. But he was, putting it off like he was a believer, and that's where I was.
What if, because, we talked about rhetoric and how rhetoric is,
right.
You have to come to somebody with a certain way, come into it from their perspective,
Right.
and then towards the end flip it back and try to see if they can now kind of bridge that gap, the understanding gap. So I mean, I don't know if that's what he was doing, but yeah, there's a lot. But I've listened to atheists
Right.
talk who are they're atheists, but they're actually very interested in faith and wanting to
Right.
be made to believe, or wanting to get people to see it from their side. So it's like,
Yeah.
if you talk to someone with the parts that you believe, and you believe that so much, those parts so much that you can bridge that gap with someone else, then telling them after the fact that, I mean, we was having this great conversation, we had so many things in common.
Right.
Guess what? I'm actually atheist.
Yeah.
And then the person be like, what?
Well, that reminds me of, in a way, it made me think of, we're going to cover Sartre later this semester. He's maybe not a good example of this, but existentialism is a philosophy we'll look at later this semester. And I would say, like what you said earlier, that a lot of atheists will have some deep things to say about religion. I would say, existential philosophy, most of the existentialists were atheists, but a lot of them had respect for religion, or they thought that because society was becoming more secular, that was a bad thing. That wasn't necessarily a good thing. That the religion actually served a good function, and it gave meaning to life. And so, yeah, I think that point about atheism, that you can have these discussions about spiritual matters with people that you might not classify as spiritual. One other thing, and we got 2 minutes before we got to cut loose, but you mentioned rhetoric. Normally that word rhetoric is taken negatively in the context of philosophy, especially when we're talking about Plato. He thought rhetoric was bad, was false. You're using language. Melitus is using rhetoric. He's kissing the ass of the jury and saying they all improve the youth just to make them feel good because he doesn't want to alienate them. But I think you made a good point that maybe rhetoric isn't always so bad, right? Maybe in a way you need to understand language. You have to understand how language affects people, because if we go back to Plato's allegory of the cave, right? When the guy goes back to the cave, he's trying to bridge that gap. That was the expression I think we used a lot last class. And I think maybe rhetoric and understanding language and how it affects people, it could be used for good, not just for bad, right? Aristotle actually wrote a book on rhetoric, so he was a philosopher that accepted that. Plato seems to kind of overlook that part, or at least he doesn't acknowledge it that I know of. But I think, you made a good point. Maybe, rhetoric can be used to deceive and to lie and to get our way, but maybe sometimes we have to understand how does this word affect that person? I might understand it a little differently than them, and it's kind of clouding our communication, right? But I think
that's the reason why people don't seem it's to compare it to modern days. It's people do still seem to think that rhetoric is negative. You have to be able to talk to people a certain way. It's to be able to nuance your voice, eat back and forth to get people to understand your experiences. People don't want to. There's a lot of pushback, like there was in this case.
I think also a big problem is that they're using the word differently, right? Like when they use it negatively, they mean something different, right? You'll hear it in politics, oh, that's just a bunch of rhetoric. There's nothing behind it, right? That would be a negative use of the word. But you can take a class in college in rhetoric, and that's not negative. It's just style, how to write well, So I think that
it's supposed to, what they mean is semantics.
Right, right. How to construct sentences and in a good way. Semantics, style, your manner of speaking. All right, well, this is a good place to stop. I'm already 1 minute over. If you guys want to leave, you can leave. I'll stick around for a couple minutes, I guess, in case there's any questions or anything like that. Otherwise, you guys have a great weekend, and try to finish the apology, because we're going to try to get through as much of it as we can next time, almost to the end. So, anybody got any questions? You can type it in or jump in. No? All right, I'm gonna
No,
pause.
have a good
You
weekend.
too.